Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael, and I will be discussing the antebellum period, period 4, which starts about 1800 and ends 1848. So, this period can really be split into four sections, which we'll be covering. Firstly, we have the Jefferson era. Second, we have the era of good feelings. Third, we have the Jacksonian era. And lastly, we'll have the Industrial Revolution, setting up the events for the next period tomorrow. So, to start it off, we have the Jeffersonian era, where Thomas Jefferson becomes president. Now, how does he become president? Well, he defeats John Adams, who is a Federalist, by 8 electoral votes. But the problem is that he is tied with Aaron Burr. The way he wins is that he is assisted by his old rival, Alexander Hamilton, who agrees to help him just this once. And although their philosophies were different, they were both united against Burr. And so, in this, with this support, Jefferson was elected. And so, after this, the Federalists slowly declined in power, and they were never really able to recover from this. This isn't the death of the Federalist Party. You will see how that happens later on, and I'll explain why they actually died out. But this was generally a phase in which they weakened after losing a chance at an election. So the Jefferson era itself was peaceful, if controversial, and it was a transition of power between power from the Federalists to the Republicans. Jefferson really limited the involvement of the government, and he cut federal expenses. He also wanted to reduce military spending. He reduced the army. He also decreased the power of the national bank, and this is because Jefferson believed that the national bank had too much power. So now, he also what he also did is he eliminated all internal taxes. Internal taxes are general taxes imposed on items and lands within a nation or colony. So yes, he opposed the First National Bank, but Congress did not. They thought the bank was constitutional. So despite the fact that many Jeffersonians opposed it, Congress granted it a 20-year charter. So the First National Bank was able to survive. Thomas Jefferson also embraced slavery. A lot of top people who were elites, they embraced slavery. They also owned slaves. However, this is quite conflicted because Jefferson publicly opposed slavery and heavily criticized it. But he still profited from it, and he had many slaves himself. So it's really hard to make sense of where his beliefs ended. Um, but an episode that occurred between him and former President John Adams was when, at the time, President Adams made some appointments with Federalists. Basically, he wanted to influence some future policies, and that's why he had these appointments. However, the signed documents were not authorized, and Jefferson argued these appointments were invalid at all. And this whole argument led to Marbury versus Madison, a case where judicial review was first introduced and established. Judicial review is the ability of Supreme Court to make a law. That wrapped that up and really culminated in eventually this very important aspect, judicial review, playing a part in many other cases. Now, another important event that occurred was the Louisiana Purchase, which was a deal between France and America. Essentially, the U.S. purchased land, and it was more than doubled by the amount of land it got. And Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and Clark on a journey to explore that land. But slowly but surely, we have tensions rising between Britain and the US. And this ultimately culminates in the War of 1812, the second war between Britain and America. So, really, what happens is they start threatening US ships. And America becomes very angry with them. But it isn't until Britain starts a policy of impressment where things really start heating up. And impressment is where The British Army, the British Navy more specifically, would stop U.S. ships, and then they would force American sailors to be drafted into their army. About this time, the First National Bank, which I previously mentioned, was being heavily criticized for the fact that two-thirds of its bank stock was being held by British interests. People also didn't like that the bank was being careful with its financial spending. They really believed that it was constraining economic development. Critics like this, they were able to prevent the charter from being renewed in 1811, and so the bank collapsed. Even Congress couldn't save that. War was ultimately approved by the spring of 1812. This was established by the breaking of Jay's Treaty, an attempt to reach negotiations between America and Britain during 1794. Jay's Treaty was made when Britain kept taking American trading ships. Britain was multitasking while fighting in the War of 1812. They also had to deal with Napoleon and his European conquests, so they were managing both sides. But they did gain a victory at Washington. They were able to sack it, burn the Capitol along with other U.S. buildings. And so, really, this war, it really transitions way past Jefferson. So they burned the Capitol, they burned some other U.S. buildings, but the Americans are able to score a decisive victory at the Battle of New Orleans. And even though a peace treaty had already been signed before the battle, the British had not reached word of that, and so the battle kept going. But finally, we have an armistice signed on Christmas Eve 1814. Basically puts an end to the war. And now the consequences. What happened because of that? Well, I mentioned before the Federalist Party. It was growing weak. Well, they heavily opposed the war. And at one point in 1814, sometime before the Treaty of Ghent, they threatened to secede from the U.S., specifically Federalists from New England. And they threatened to form their own country if peace wouldn't be sought out. Well, once the Treaty of Ghent was signed, people began to view the Federalists as traitors, and then the party collapsed entirely, died out. They were no longer popular. Another effect of this was that American industries had to manufacture products that they could no longer get from Britain, as they had just fought a war. But ultimately, this strengthened the resolve that the U.S. was independent from other nations. It didn't need to rely on anyone. Now we have the next era, which is the era of good feelings. So our next later on. So we start with the fall of the Federalists. We start on the War of 1812 ending, and there was a feeling wanted unity. Now, a side note, something that happened in between this section and the first section, something that kind of transposed. It isn't super important, but still keep in mind. We have the Second Great Awakening. That happens from 1790 to 1840. Essentially, it's a religious revival, and it consists of many evangelical meetings. Basically, as the picture shows here, it's led by preachers who have sermons all over the country, and you have large camp meetings, like in the picture. And essentially, this not only pushed the idea of free will, but it increased the number of Christians. Was still president at this time, but there were three presidents during the section: James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. I'll be going into depth about what happened under each of their terms. So, firstly, after the Federalists die out, there's a feeling of wanting unity. But also there's a problem. The amount of inflation cases grow higher and higher among the many notes issued by private banks. Many moneylenders and financiers believed that re-establishing a national bank would solve these problems. They thought they would also prevent the amount of inflation that is occurring. And it will also restore a stable currency. So what they do is they establish a second national bank. So that solves that problem, but you will see that these national banks have a habit of people criticizing them and overstepping their boundaries. Another very important thing that starts around 1818 is that people who lived in the Missouri Territory, which at the time was applying for statehood, they wanted it to become a slave state. This set off a big argument in Congress, which was divided into two groups: slavery and anti-slavery. Basically, there was a failed attempt to pass a bill by Representative James Talmadge, and that ultimately would have ended slavery in Missouri, which was not what they wanted. But then another option arose. The Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, proposed that Missouri be admitted as a slave state and Maine would be a free state. Now, Henry Clay is a very important character in this section and in the next. He plays very important parts, and he slowly gets more and more power. So he proposes this option, and it's passed. Missouri is made a slave state, and Maine is made a free state. But Senate adds another part. They declare that slavery would be banned in all of the land earned in the Louisiana Purchase north of an imaginary line, which is basically drawn at a 30 degree latitude, with the exception of Missouri, of course. And this basically establishes the Missouri Compromise, as you can see in this map here, which is talking about which land as the slave states, which is the free, and all of this Missouri territory. But I mentioned this will not have a permanent solution, and Jefferson also, he noted that it's not, this question of slave states and free states is only temporarily resolved. The goal of the Missouri Compromise, keep this in mind, is that both sides be balanced. Neither free states nor slave states have too much power than the other, establishing a balance. But this ultimately raises the question of does slave states, do they even have a place in our country? And this will be explored as the farther we move on towards the Civil War, which will be covered tomorrow. So now let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine. It's very important, and I'll begin with the fact that this is under James Monroe, of course. And it starts with the fact that during the early 1820s, many Latin American countries had won their independence from either Spain or Portugal. In 1822, the U.S. recognized the new republics of such countries, and these included Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. However, the U.S. and also Britain worried that European countries would try to colonize these newly built nations and impose their own government system on them. Now, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who would later become president, the last president of this section, he convinced President Monroe to make a U.S. policy statement. And basically, this would allow the U.S. to claim the role as a sort of protector for the entire Western Hemisphere. This statement was called the Monroe Doctrine, and it began in December 2nd, 1823. And it had four main points. Point 1. The U.S. won't interfere with wars between European countries. It's not our business. Point 2. The U.S. won't interfere with already existing colonies. Now, the last 2 points are very closely linked. The Western Hemisphere is close to any colonization, and any attempt by a European country to colonize in the Western Hemisphere will be viewed as a hostile act against the U.S. Now, I would write this whole thing down, all of these 4 points, because it's very important for America's relationship with other countries and how it responds. So after that, we have John Quincy Adams, the secretary of James Monroe, becoming president. He becomes president, and a notable act that happens under him is the Adams-Onis Treaty. And this is a deal between Spain and the U.S. in which Florida was given to America, and in return, the U.S. relinquished claims on parts of Spanish Texas. Now, we'll cover a bit more about John Quincy Adams in the next section, but the star of it is definitely Andrew Jackson. This is the Jacksonian Era. So, let's talk a bit about Andrew Jackson and then talk about how this related to the current president, John Quincy Adams. So, Andrew Jackson fought in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, and he won it. He came back a war hero. And he wanted to be nominated for president, and he was nominated for president in 1824, but he lost to John Quincy Adams. Now, Jackson believed that Adams had won because of a deal he'd made with Henry Clay. The Henry Clay, once again, is the Speaker of the House who helped pass the current option in the Missouri Compromise. The deal was called the corrupt bargain. Write this down. This is where Adams had Henry Clay supporting him in exchange for making Henry Clay his Secretary of State. Without the deal, Jackson was sure he would have won the presidency. During 1812, he was dedicated to winning. He had to do this. Right around this time, people were also more involved in politics. A reason for this is the property requirement to vote was dropped in some areas, and so more working class males were able to vote. Jackson, he really promised to empower the common man, and this helped him gain votes. This made him more popular. In addition, John Quincy Adams, he was growing really unpopular with Congress because he took positions Congress didn't support. These included funding scientific explorations and wanting a stronger federal government. As a result, this ended up with Jackson finally winning with a large amount of votes, electoral votes, to be specific, 178 votes with John Quincy Adams' 83 votes. So he won, and that ushered in the Jacksonian Era, and it definitely had a lot of new conflicts emerge. This basically saw the emergence of two rivaling parties. You have Jackson's Democrats, and you have the Whig Party. Now, let's talk about the Whigs, and let's talk about Henry Clay, because I did say he is mainly gonna be prominent in the Jacksonian Era. This isn't the last you've seen of him. He becomes the leader of the Whig Party. Now, I'll talk a bit about Henry Clay himself because he keeps appearing, and then about the Whigs themselves. So, about Henry Clay. He, as I mentioned before, was Speaker of the House, but he also helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent back in the War of 1812. Like Jefferson, he owned slaves, but he also publicly opposed it. He supported high tariffs and internal improvements. Something notable that he did was he created an economic program called the American System, which supported the Second National Bank and also tariffs and internal improvements. Really, it aligned with his beliefs. Now, the Whigs themselves. The Whig Party was named after a group of the same name during the time of the American Revolution, which was developed around 1776. And basically, the idea was that they fought for freedom and from the tyranny of the government. And the current Whig Party heavily opposed Andrew Jackson's policies. They opposed a lot of the later things he would do, and they also had this belief that Andrew Jackson was a tyrant. Now I'll explain why in a couple minutes. So now that I've established the Whig Party, let's go into how Andrew Jackson started off his presidency and what kind of a man he was. So, as president, Andrew Jackson frequently vetoed acts or laws, and he didn't always listen to Congress. He wanted to make it clear that he was urged by the Whig Party, and they depicted him as this tyrannical king instead of a president. And that's aligned with the Whig Party's beliefs. Now here you have a cartoon that has King Andrew I, and you have him stepping on the Constitution, showing he doesn't care about Congress. He only cares about what he thinks, and he will do whatever he can to pass it. This is, in a sense, comparing him to King George, way back at the time of the American Revolution. So, the basis of Jackson's policy was mainly to destroy any class bias, and he appealed mainly to the lower classes. He hated the upper class and how rich they were, and he believed they had too much power. He also believed that the Second National Bank oppressed the people, and he resented the fact that it had so much political and economical power. He also disliked the fact that the bank didn't fund much expansion into Western territories. And so he decided to shut down the Second National Bank of the US. Now, again, Jackson thinks what Jefferson thought. Both of them believe that the national bank has too much power, but they go about it in a bit different ways. Jackson tried to shut down the Second National Bank of the US. He ended up succeeding, but there were some obstacles in his way. Firstly, he called for an investigation into the bank's policies, and then he presented his case against the bank before Congress. The director of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, was horrified, so he turned to Andrew Jackson's rival, Kentucky Senator Henry Clay, to help him with this. However, Henry Clay himself could not help. Andrew Jackson ultimately the only thing standing in his way was Congress, and Congress believed the bank was constitutional. They, in fact, tried to draw up a charter for the bank, but the president vetoed it. Now comes something very controversial. Despite the fact that Congress believed in the bank's constitutionality, Andrew Jackson removed all federal funds from the bank on September 10th, 1833, and he distributed them to state banks. As a result of this decision, Congress chastised Andrew Jackson for abusing his power during this bank war, as it was called. Now that ends this whole bank war, the destruction of the Second National Bank, as you can see in this picture. Jackson is slaying this monster, which is a metaphor or symbol for the bank. Now, something very important, which also occurred under Andrew Jackson's time and marks them as this kind of tyrannical king in the eyes of some people, was the Nullification Crisis, which occurred between the state of Carolina and the Union. And the state of Carolina suffered economically. Now, I'll go into some background and then I'll explain how that ties in. So, to start it off, the North was developing, slowly, but it was developing, and it was becoming more industrial, more technologically based. The South was still very agriculturally based. Tariffs were great for business in the North, but the South despised it. So the state of South Carolina wasn't doing well. It blamed this on the War of 1812, and so it threatened to leave the Union. And behind it rallied many other southern states, and they happened to be rallied by Jackson's own vice president, John C. Calhoun, and they ended up nullifying it. Nullifying is when you ignore a federal law. Jackson, he tried to lower the tariff a bit. He tried to appease him. He said, okay, I'll lower it. Will that satisfy you? The South still wasn't happy, and they still wanted to leave the U.S. And that's when Jackson decides to threaten military action against them. He says, okay, you can secede, and seceding is when you formally withdraw from a federal union. He says, all right, you can leave, but I have my full forces, and we will come for you. And so they quieted down. And of course, around this time, not getting his way, John C. Calhoun resigned as Jackson's vice president. During this time, also there was the Panic of 1837. This began with the fact that banks in New York were running out of gold and silver, and people were rushing to exchange banknotes for actual currency. This got to a point where the banks stopped redeeming their notes. And this was a type of situation that was mirrored in many other states, until it got to the point where the country reached an economic depression. Now, let's talk about some acts passed by Andrew Jackson, something very notable that he did. So, we have a very controversial one, the Indian Removal Act. Now, this involved some background on Andrew Jackson's view of American Indians. So, Andrew Jackson, when he grew up on plantations, which was frequent to many American Indian raids. He also heard that these raids were common. There were many reports of American Indians raiding them, but also as the country was developing, he wanted to appease the lower class, and so he decided to move the American Indians west. He decided to this basically has the American this basically was the Indian Removal Act. It was passed on May 26, 1830, and it had multiple tribes, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Seminole, relocated to lands west of the Mississippi River. He also had a very negative view of American Indians, not just because they raided these plantations. He believed that they were inferior to white-skinned people. So this rough path that was taken by the American Indians, it killed 1/4 of the entire population. And this path is well known as the Trail of Tears. Once he got them to move west, more settlers were able to take their land. Andrew Jackson is a kind of president that he gets what he wants and he doesn't ask Congress about it. He destroys the Second National Bank, ultimately without Congress's permission, and he also passed this a mostly unpopular act, although his voters really appreciated it. Now, on July 4th, 1831, there were French spoliation claims. Essentially, what happened was France was forced to pay $5 million to the U.S. to settle spoliation claims starting from the time of way back in the Napoleonic Wars. Firstly, France tried to decline, but U.S. representatives warned of their superior navy, and ultimately they ended up paying. So that sums up the Jacksonian era. Mainly, I'd pay attention to how Jackson has these fights with Congress, how he fights with Henry Clay, but ultimately he gets what he wants, he destroys the bank, and he really is considered a man of the people. He hates these elitist class. He wasn't satisfied with it, and he ended up getting his way. And also pay attention to South Carolina, which wasn't happy with the tariffs he imposed. They tried to secede, it didn't work. But this is also, like with the Missouri Compromise, something that isn't settled all the way. Many of these problems about slave states, about the South, they will all come up the later we progress until it all culminates in the Civil War. So now we head into the first industrial revolution. So, some background here. Britain had its first industrial revolution sometime around the 1780s. And it's fair to say they came first and we copied a lot of the things that came around our time. Like with Britain, what allowed the US to kick off with its industrial revolution was that it had great access to natural resources, which included timber, water, coal, iron, copper, silver, and gold. I mentioned copying. So this is commonly seen when a man named Samuel Slater opened the first industrial mill in the US, and that's actually how the British started out. This greatly sped up the rate and speed at which cotton was spun into yarn. After that, a man named Robert Fulton started the steamboat services on the Hudson River, and Samuel Norse began the telegraph. This was a time in the North where technology was flourishing and all of these modern innovations were being developed, and the rate at all of these things was developing was being sped up. It was a really great time in the North. But of course, since it was like Britain, the industrial conditions mirrored that of London as well, when it had been at the time of the Industrial Revolution. For example, you have people urban who leave urban areas to work in these cities to find a job, but you have very squeezed living conditions, bad sanitation, you have it being very dangerous for children and very toxic, and you have many people dying because of that. But something notable was the construction of the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825. It served as a route of transportation, a great route of transportation, and it provided a direct route from New York City to the Midwest. This amount of access made New York the most popular place in commerce in the US, while originally, compared to New Orleans, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, they were originally outranking New York before the canal was completed, but that all changed. Another great source of transportation was the first major railroad of the U.S., which was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Now let's go into some economic differences between the North and South. The South relied heavily on slaves for their economy, as well as cash crops such as cotton, sugar, and tobacco. These crops would be produced on plantations where slaves endlessly worked and toiled. The soil was rich and perfect for farming. However, the North wasn't big into agriculture. The reason for that was that its soil wasn't as good as farming cotton, which is the key cash crop. Without it, there's really no point at trying their hand at agriculture. In addition, in the North, transportation was way easier, and it contained more than two-thirds of the amount of railroad tracks in the country. And that is the antebellum period. Pay attention to the rising conflicts between the North and the South, the Missouri Compromise, and the Nullification Crisis, because that will eventually build into great conflicts between the Union and the South, and that'll end up in the Civil War, which Justin will be covering tomorrow. Thank you, and if you have any questions, please ask on our Discord. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.